Hello everyone, we're going to be taking a look at the early histories of Korea and Japan and seeing how it is connected to what we've learned about China. So we're going to begin with Korea. Korea had a very decentralized history up through the early 900s CE. So we're not going to learn about all of these kingdoms that existed throughout the Korean peninsula. We're going to focus on a couple of them though. So, up through the year 900, there was no one kingdom that ruled all of the Korean peninsula. But over time, one kingdom called the Silla does grow really influential in the region. And a big reason for that is most likely due to the fact that they did recognize China as their tributary overlord. We'll remember that the Chinese established what were called tributary states, which was a way for them to have greater influence in the region without having to use their military very heavy-handedly throughout the world. So the Silla dynasty pretty much accepts the Chinese as this, which gave them a very strong connection to China, which we know was very powerful. So whether we're talking about economics or the military, the Silla had a great ally in China, which over time helped them to grow in more influence in the region. I just want to highlight a couple of the ways that China was very influential to the Silla, and we'll watch that influence grow. First, the Silla adopt the Chinese structure of government. Hopefully we remember that the Confucian dynasties, such as the Han and the Tang, had a very organized government that leaned heavily on Confucianism as not only a philosophy but also as a educational culture to inform and structure their government. So all of this is introduced to Korea at this point, although they still heavily favored the concept of the nobility, right? People getting their jobs because they were born into a very influential family. So they didn't adopt things yet quite like the university and exam system that we learned about, but that will come later. Confucianism really starts to grow throughout Korea because Korean scholars would actually go and study abroad in China in those huge universities that we talked about before. So little by little, these scholars bring back lots of stuff that they learn in China to Korea, and it grows in influence throughout the peninsula. So one of these examples is the influence of Chinese writing on Korean writing. So there are multiple writing systems throughout Korea up through the year 900. So when the Silla dynasty became more powerful throughout Korea, they instituted a writing system that blended the Chinese character system with the Korean language. So this is a selection of what some of those characters looked like. There were, so many of them. I should know the number, but I don't. And it's important because it does help to unify the writing culture of the time. But I'll talk about in a second just how complicated it was. I do want to point out, and maybe someone knows who's watching this, but whenever I look at this chart or other examples from this era, I always see a lot of faces, right? So like this guy right here, I think he's so cute. I don't know what the symbol means, but I see this as a face. I see this smiling little person over here, this person hanging out in a hat. This guy seems to be smiling too. I just thought I'd share that with you because it always makes me smile. But anyway, so this is a wonderful development because it means that scholars from the northern parts of Korea, the southern, the western, the eastern, all have a standard by which they can communicate, which is great because the writing system was not centralized before. But Chinese writing is so complex, and because there are thousands of Chinese characters, it becomes very difficult to be literate using the Chinese writing system. So from about the year 900 through almost the year 1500, this is the dominant writing system in Korea. We're going to talk more about this dynasty in the next unit that we study, but I do want to introduce you to the Hangul alphabet because it's such a really great story. The alphabet that is currently used in Korea was founded in 1443 by this emperor named Emperor Sejong the Great, who was a part of the Joseon Dynasty, which is more dominant in the next unit that we'll study. But they begin to rise in the late 1400s or mid 1400s. And Emperor Sejong the Great is such an interesting person. He was a scholar. He wasn't as heavily involved in the military, even though he made some great strides within the defense of Korea. But he was known as just this like brilliant emperor who really cared about the people. And one of the things that really bothered him was how few people actually knew how to read and write in Korea. And he blamed it largely on how difficult it was to understand Chinese script. So he himself developed a phonetic alphabet, shown here, that is so much easier to learn than the Chinese writing system. And he did it so that more people could learn to read and write. He used a system to write tons of books and to get other scholars to write tons of books on the sciences and arts, and is known to have just helped this, almost like this renaissance grow in Korea, all because he wanted his people to know how to read better. So as I said, Hangul was designed to be easier, way easier to learn. And so literacy rates really do go way up because of this. So I just want to introduce this to you now because I think it's interesting that, yes, the Chinese writing system helped us kind of unify Korea in a way, but it was a little bit holding people back until Emperor Sejong the Great comes up with the Hangul alphabet. And this is a statue of Emperor Sejong. You always see him holding a book, right? Because he was known as this like bookworm of an emperor. And he just really just seems like a very cool person. So the next dynasty that really, really does unify the Korean peninsula is the Choreo Dynasty. So the Choreo Dynasty, which is where we get the term Korea from, reigns from around 900 through almost 1400. And they build off of what the Silla dynasty was doing. They unite the peninsula first through war, but they continue a lot of the traditions and some of the standards set by the Silla dynasty before them. So they also work closely with the Chinese, and they went further and they like adopted the university system and the civil service exam to create a way more efficient government. I've read that their exams weren't as intense as the Chinese, but that they still were very effective in training people to work within the government. In this time period, Confucianism was very deeply embraced, and we'll remember that Confucianism both functions as a social philosophy to order the families and to always have a sense of who's inferior and who's superior in a relationship, and to honor that through ritual. So, if you were to travel throughout Korea today, you do see that very heavily in family relationships and how young people treat old people. It's very embedded in Korean culture because of Chinese influence. The Choreo Dynasty is also known as the Golden Age of Korean Buddhism. Buddhism arrives to Korea via China. So through trade routes over time, right, both by land as well as by sea, Buddhism comes to Korea, as well as through merchants, all that type of stuff. So the Choreo Dynasty, we see a blossoming of Buddhism. We're going to do a separate look at the form of Buddhism that becomes really popular. It's known as Chan Buddhism. Chan Buddhism is known as Zen Buddhism in Japan, and so when we look at that on its own, we'll see that it blends in some animist beliefs and some like Taoist beliefs, and just has a different emphasis of other forms of Mahayana Buddhism that we've studied before. But all of this is coming to Korea and Japan through China. This is the flag of the Choreo Dynasty down here. And a symbol that becomes very popular via the Choreo Dynasty is the Taekook, which if you look at here, this is some of the earliest examples or an early illustration of the Taekook, which you can almost think of it as like a Korean yin-yang to a degree. So you may see it with 3 colors, you may see it with 2 colors. The earliest examples, which are first seen in Korean shamanism or a form of Korean animism, had 3 colors. Red symbolizing the earth, blue symbolizing the heavens, and yellow symbolizing humanity. And the idea, as you can see all of them swirled together, is that they should all live in balance and harmony. Again, very similar to the concept of the yin yang. So this was a very local icon, well before the Silla and the Choreo dynasties. But since the Choreo dynasty really unified Korea, it becomes a far more universal symbol, to the point where it eventually becomes a part of the Korean flag. And you see it throughout a lot of Korean art and architecture, right? It's a symbol of Korean unity now. Another example of art I do want to show you that's connected to Korea, specifically the Choreo dynasty, is a form of porcelain called Celadon porcelain. So this is one example of really beautiful Celadon porcelain. So Celadon porcelain becomes very popular because the Chinese really liked it. Hopefully remember that the Chinese invent what we know as porcelain during the Tang and Song dynasties. And porcelain is important for both art and for trade because it's a form of ceramics that is both strong but also really fine and delicate, just because of the methods used to make it. And the Koreans adopt this concept of porcelain, but they make it their own. And they make this Celadon porcelain that has this very beautiful blue-green glaze on it. And if you really look in, you can see this crackle that happens when the glaze is fired. Celadon porcelain becomes one of the most popular forms of porcelain, and is considered like the finest, like most beautiful glaze, because the color is so distinct, that crackle is so unique. And what's interesting is that the Koreans invented it, and then the Chinese tried to copy the Koreans, but they couldn't do it because there's something about the minerals in the earth that the Koreans used to create both the clay and the glaze, that just can't be copied. Like, you have to get it from Korean land and from Korean water, right? Something about the elements and the earth itself in Korea makes this happen. So Korea was able to maintain its dominance of this particular trade, and it made Korea a very popular place for merchants to go to try to get their hands on examples of this, to trade, and so it helped to make Korea pretty rich and famous in terms of the arts. I want to look at a little bit of Korean architecture, so we can continue to look at both the influence of China, but also what makes Korea unique. So we start to see some of the first examples of what's called that pagoda roof or Song style roof in the Silla dynasty. So it's actually a rebuilding. A lot of Korean architecture was destroyed over the centuries because poor Korea, we'll see, often gets caught between China, Russia, and Japan. And a lot's been lost in Korea throughout the centuries. So this has actually been rebuilt, but it's very accurate to what it originally looked like. But we can see that very Chinese-style architecture, which hopefully we'll remember, was actually inspired by India. So a lot of these pagoda-style roofs. Here's another example in the mountains. So here we can see, again, very classic pagoda-style roof, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then another example up here. We also have a standing Buddha, and again, we're going to talk about Chan and Zen Buddhism later. So we can see a heavy influence of the Chinese and thus the Indians. And then one thing that is interesting is that the monasteries in Korea, where the nuns and the monks live and worship, are mostly in the mountains. Part of that has to do with its very peaceful environment. But there was a period of time when Confucianism, just like in China, was almost combating Buddhism in order to get more order. And so some of the monasteries that were closer to the cities were shut down, leaving only the mountain monasteries open. And they're very beautiful. I visited some, very peaceful. So again, you can see the pagoda roofs, but it's set in nature. Very pretty. So this is from one of my hikes in like Western Korea, where you're hiking along and you see these little Buddhist buildings popping out of the woods. There you can see the swastika as a reminder that it was originally a symbol of peace. It's woven into a lot of Buddhist art. And then this is another photo of mine, which there's like a heavy filter on it, but I want to show you this because it's one of many buildings in this one Buddhist temple structure. And so you can see again the classic Chinese pagoda style roof, but you can see the Taekook here, right, or the little Korean yin yang or symbol for Korea that's imprinted on it. So it's a reminder again of that concept of acculturation, that the Koreans embrace this influence from somewhere else, but they make it their own. Just a couple more examples of Korean architecture. So this is in the city of Seoul. This is a later Chosun era building, just very beautiful. Highly recommend traveling to Korea. And again, another example of Korean architecture. So I also want to introduce the early history of Japan and do, again, more of a look at its early beginnings and early Chinese influence in the region. Before we talk about that and some of the earliest kingdoms, I do want to acknowledge the importance of Japanese geography. Japan is a very unique place for so many reasons, but a big reason has to do with its geography itself. Japan is a chain of islands, which is known as an archipelago. And there are literally actually hundreds of islands in Japan. Some of them are very small, like you could barely stand on them. There are the main ones, like Honshu, which is the big and really the flatter island, which is where many of the big cities are, and Hokkaido up north. And then if you go far south, there's actually off of the map right here, this little grid is where you get like Okinawa and whatnot. So I want to talk about the effects of Japan being a chain of islands, or better known as an archipelago. So some of this you know from your studies of World War II. One of like the pros of living in an archipelago is that it's good for defense. We know that the Americans had a very hard time attacking Japan because it was a chain of islands, so they had to do a lot of island hopping, which gave the Japanese time to prepare. And that's been a big thing throughout Japanese history, being protected by being a chain of islands. These islands were forged by volcanoes, which bring very rich nutrients to the soil. So the soil is rich for agriculture, but since these islands have been forged by volcanoes, it means they can be very mountainous, which is it's hard to grow food on a mountainside. So it's like this weird, tricky thing where the soil is rich, but the mountains make it hard to grow food. The other thing is that since these are pretty like new islands in a geological sense, there's not a lot of resources. Later, Japan will realize it has a lot of silver and stuff like that, but there aren't a lot of local resources that they can use to make goods for foreign trade or even to support themselves to a degree. So one of the themes throughout Japanese history is that they do become dependent on importing raw materials from other countries, which can put them in a tricky situation from time to time. This is looking at why Japan is what it is, this chain of islands. Japan sits on what's called the Ring of Fire, which is where these tectonic plates all crash against each other, and there's these rings of volcanoes, and there's a lot of earthquake activity that happens on this Ring of Fire. So all of the red spots are places where there essentially is like active volcanic activity, and which makes things tricky. You were very young, but there was a huge earthquake and tsunami that really messed Japan up not that long ago. And they kind of realized how fragile parts of their infrastructure were as a result. So that explains why Japan is an archipelago. And this is just a beautiful image of Japan. I don't know, can't help myself. There's Mount Fuji and another pagoda-style roof, but a Japanese style, and the cherry blossoms. So just as a reminder, because we have learned about this before, that culturally, the oldest religion in Japan is the Shinto religion, which is the animist faith that believes that everything has a spirit, and those spirits are known as kamis. And since everything has a spirit, there's this emphasis on super respecting nature. The way that they interpret the gods is very localized, um, and it's just woven into daily life. We'll remember that the torii gates are the symbol for Shintoism, and these gates are placed before shrines as a reminder that you are passing from the mundane world to the divine world. So, what's interesting about Shintoism is that it's a very flexible faith, and since it's not an exclusive religion, meaning you can believe in more than just Shintoism, as Buddhism and other practices come into Japan, they can live alongside of each other or blend with each other. So, because of this, Shintoism never goes away. Right? It's going to be a very important cultural influence in Japan throughout its history. And just a couple images of some shrines. This is a tiny baby shrine, and lightning bolts are usually ways that the gods or the kami talk to people. So you see that image a lot. So just a couple notes about some of the earliest governments in Japan. The first centralized government of Japan is known as the Nara Kingdom, and then sometimes referred to as the Nara period. It is centered around the city of Nara, which is pretty close to modern-day Tokyo, kind of in between Tokyo and Kyoto. And if we look at the dates here, it's like around the year 700 CE. It takes that long for the Japanese population to be concentrated enough to lead to a kingdom because of, like I said, it's kind of difficult to grow a ton of food to support a big population. So that only happens by the year around 700. At this point, the economy of Japan is still highly agricultural, also a lot of fishing, we should note. And in the year 700, the Nara kings embrace a relationship of the Sui and the Tang dynasties of China. And just like Korea, they begin to travel back and forth and accept Chinese influence. So they will also copy the Chinese government model. They employ something that the Tang dynasty does, which is called the equal field system, which tried to make sure that the peasants had enough land to support themselves. They also embraced Confucianism as a political philosophy, but also Buddhism comes to the region because of the Chinese. And just like the Koreans, they also adopted the Chinese writing system because there wasn't a centralized Japanese writing system. And so just a couple images here. So this is the Todaiji Temple, which has a huge Buddha in it. You're not supposed to take pictures of it, so I don't have one. But you can see that the Japanese have also embraced the pagoda-style roofs or the Song-style roof. But over time, they definitely make it their own. So we have that as an example. One of my other favorite things about the Nara palace structure is if you visit, and I'm going to put a video you guys can see, but if you visit, you'll notice there's a ton of deer walking around the Nara Imperial Palace. These deer are so friendly. You can see this guy's like surrounded by them, and they just kind of walk around hanging out. And the reason for this is that because Shintoism means that you really have to respect nature, there are multiple temple complexes throughout Japan in which it has been illegal to hurt the nature in that area for so long, for hundreds and hundreds of years, that the animals there are not afraid of people. And in fact, you can like buy little cookies to feed the deer here. And it's really cute. The deer will come up to you and they bow to ask for a cookie. I don't know how they learned that, but it's very cute. Sometimes overwhelming when there's a lot coming, but it's a really neat experience and I highly recommend. And that I'll post like a YouTube video showing you guys what that looked like. So the second kingdom that I want to mention in Japanese history is the Haiyan Kingdom, or the Haiyan period of Japan. So from around almost 800 to about 1100, what we start to see is a shift in power. So there has been an emperor in Japan, but over time the emperor becomes a figurehead because the nobles or the aristocracy starts to get really powerful because they start to get very rich from trade between China and Japan. They start to grow their own militaries, and over time those militaries fight each other, and then Japan will descend into a feudal period where the samurai become the warrior class. and we'll chat more about that at another time. The Haiyan period builds a new capital in the city of Kyoto, so this is their imperial structure. Again, you can see the Chinese influence, but also weaving in specific like Japanese style. Just like in Korea, the Japanese were so not just dependent on China, but inspired by China, that they sent their boys to study in those Chinese universities. And we're talking about the noble class here. The peasants would not have done this. But because of this, Chinese becomes the language of the government. All the boys write in Chinese. And then, just like in Korea, there's a long period of time in which the Japanese script is heavily, heavily influenced by Chinese script. An interesting effect of this is that the noble women who were also educated, they were expected to be able to read and write, mostly for the purposes of creating art. But women were not allowed to learn Chinese because Chinese was a language of power and government. So an interesting unintended effect is that the women become the big artists of the Japanese language of this time period. And a great example of this is this classic book called The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, who's shown here. So when people study the classics of Japanese literature, they end up studying women because of this development. All right, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention.